Welcome to this final vodcast in the background of Hebrews, situation of Hebrews. This one is on the date of Hebrews, which is an issue of some debate in Hebrew scholarship. Let's dig right into it. There are a number of arguments that have been made against a post 70 date, and probably most English-speaking scholarship right now, Anglo-American scholarship right now, would argue for a pre-70 date. I don't, and obviously don't care that they don't go with me. I think probably German scholarship is a little more sympathetic to a post-70 date. I've presented in the previous vodcast my rundown of what I think is the most coherent presentation of the situation of Hebrews. And it is pretty well operated on the basis of the post 70 date. And, and my fifth point in this vodcast basically says it fits. A post 70 date fits. The cumulative case for trying to make sense of the whole of Hebrews and all the data of Hebrews fits best with a post 70 date. And so the nature of this vodcast, a lot of it will be dealing with arguments that others have made against a 70 date, but I will make positive arguments for a post 70 date at the by the time we're done with this. Let me present three big arguments that are made against a post 70 AD date. And I should clarify, in case you don't know, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So that's what 70 stands for here. It is the dividing mark between pre and post Jerusalem destruction. So, argument one against a post 70 date. Hebrews' use of the present tense in relation to Levitical cultus. This has a certain common sense to it, that if Hebrews talks about them offering sacrifices in the present tense, then surely there are sacrifices being offered in the present tense. Here's a quote from Hebrews 10. The same sacrifices that they offer, present tense, they offer continually, are never able to perfect the worshiper, since otherwise they would have ceased offering them. Now, at first glance, this sure, well, you might say, well, duh, it sure looks like there are sacrifices being offered continually, as Hebrews writes. In fact, they haven't stopped offering them. This, however, it just doesn't hold water, and pretty much all Hebrews commentators have come to admit that this argument doesn't hold any bit of water at all. That might be surprising to you. What I'm telling you is that even those Hebrew scholars who argue for a pre-70 date have admitted that the present tenses of Hebrews simply are not good arguments for a pre-70 date. Let me explain why. The basic reason is that everybody else refers to the sacrifices in the present tense. Not everybody else. But we have several instances that are clearly post 70 of various writers, both Jewish and Christian, referring to the sacrificial cultus of the temple in the present tense. In fact, I can't remember his name, but there's even an article, it's a far-fetched article, but there's an article, I think it was in the 70s, that argued that maybe there were some sacrifices being offered at the site of the Jerusalem destroyed temple to try to explain why people like Josephus can refer to the sacrificial cultus in the present tense. Anyway, so Josephus, who writes his Antiquities in the 90s, I believe it is, can refer to the temple cultus as in the present tense. He talks about how the Jews offer continuous sacrifices for the emperors and the people of Rome, and they do this daily at the expense of the Jewish community. It's quite remarkable that Josephus can say this when A, there were no sacrifices being offered at that time, and B, this at the expense of the Jewish community. I believe it was Vespasian, or I believe it was Vespasian, um, who leveled what was called the Fiscus Judaicus, which basically took the money that the Jews had been giving to the Jerusalem temple and sent it off to the Capitoline temple in Rome. And so not only is this sacrifice not being done at this time of Josephus in Jerusalem, it's being diverted to Rome at the time that Josephus is writing. So again, you might say, well, what are you talking about, Josephus? Why do you say that the Jews are offering continuous sacrifices when it's not happening? He's speaking somewhat theoretical. Hebrews is speaking somewhat theoretical of the Levitical system as an institution, not so much as a concrete thing going on right now. So basically what I'm saying here is the fact that other people refer to the sacrificial system in the present tense shows that the fact that Hebrews refers to the sacrificial in the present tense basically means nothing with regard to the dating of Hebrews. And in fact, it's not just Josephus. Clement of Rome, 90s or early 2nd century, writes of the appropriateness for the Levitical priests to complete their duties. Well, again, when Clement's writing, there are no Levitical priests completing their duties at the temple, and yet he talks about them doing this in the present tense. And here's a quote from the Epistle of Diognetus, chapter 3, which is 2nd century. The Jews, then, do well in claiming to reverence one God of the universe and to regard him as master, but so far as they offer him this worship in methods similar to those already mentioned, they are altogether at fault. Here he's speaking about sacrificial. They worship him with sacrificial methods. Well, of course, there are no Jews offering sacrificial worship at the time that Diognetus is writing this. So basically, the point is, and again, pretty much even those who favor a pre-70 date have had to admit that the present tenses in Hebrews say nothing about when Hebrews is dated. So that's the most common sense argument against a post-70 date and holds no water whatsoever. This is what I just said. It was common to refer to the operations of the Jewish cultus in the present tense even decades after its destruction, particularly because these writers are speaking in theoretical terms of the Levitical cultus as an institution, which of course Hebrews is as well. And I might say that it's far more obvious to us that the temple is toast for 2,000 years than it was to them. In other words, we have the hindsight of history to realize that the temple was not rebuilt. It would not have been at all clear to anyone living in the late decades of the first century that the temple was gone for good. In fact, it probably wasn't until the failed Bar Kokhba revolt in, what was it, 135-ish, around that time. It probably wasn't until then that it became really clear that Jerusalem was just gone, baby. And so it's easy for us, again, these kind of hidden assumptions, to assume, well, of course the temple's gone, and they would have known that. But it wasn't obvious to them, apparently, that the temple was gone for good. The second argument against a post-70 date comes from David de Silva. And he points out this phrase that I quoted earlier, would these sacrifices not have ceased being offered? He thinks it just doesn't make sense for the author of Hebrews to say this if the sacrifices had indeed ceased being offered. He wouldn't have said, wouldn't they have stopped offering these if they'd have taken care of sins? The author, De Silva believes, would not have said that if they'd actually ceased being offered. Well, to me, I think this takes the verse a little bit out of context. The focus of the statement is not at the time of Hebrews writing, but from the very beginning of the Levitical sacrificial system. What the author is saying is, wouldn't they have stopped offering these sacrifices way back in the days of Moses, or even the very first one? I mean, if when Aaron had offered this sacrifice and it took away sins, then they wouldn't have had to offer anymore. But in fact, the sacrificial system continued over and over and over and over for the centuries of the Old Covenant and up until the time of Christ. And so the point is not that they are not ceased when the author's writing. That's not what he's even saying. What he's saying is would they not have stopped a long time ago if they'd have actually been effective in taking away sin. So that's a second argument that I don't think actually um, uh, is effective against a post 70 date. The third argument, maybe the strongest, is offered by Luke Timothy Johnson, in which he says this: if the Jerusalem temple were already destroyed at the time of writing Hebrews, quote, one would think that some reference would naturally be made, not to a covenant growing obsolescent and a cult being ineffective, that's the last verse of chapter 8, but rather to a cult proven to be broken, and a cult demonstrated by God's action as a thing of the past. Now this has some common sense to it again, but let me do my best to react to it. First of all, I think that with the paradigm shift that I've suggested with regard to the situation of Hebrews, it doesn't make sense to ask, why does the author not use the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple as a piece of evidence toward the author's conclusion? Why does that not make sense? Because that's not an argument for its conclusion. That's the very reason for his argument in the first place. It's the primary datum. And so, in such a case, you would not use the destruction of the temple as one argument toward your conclusion, which is something else. Maybe don't rely on it. But if the argument, so there's a little circularity here. If the very thing is, it's gone, what are we going to do with this? And the argument is, rely on Christ and don't worry about uh, those kinds of the Levitical sacrificial system. You see, when you make that paradigm shift, Luke Timothy Johnson's argument doesn't have as much force, because the author isn't the point of the author's argument isn't don't rely on the cultists. That's not the point of the argument. The point is rely on Christ, and the destruction becomes the elephant in the room, as it were, the reason why we're having this whole discussion in the first place. Now, it is, of course, possible that Hebrews does allude to the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. For example, what does the author mean in 13:14 when he says, we do not have here any remaining city, but we seek one is to come? Doesn't that sound a little bit like an author telling them not to worry about the fact that their city is gone, the city that they had, the city of Zion? Or for those who, chapter 11, for those who say such things, make it clear that they seek a homeland. This picture of Abraham wandering, not having as a stranger and alien on the earth. And I might say I didn't get them into my PowerPoint, and I apologize for that. But this shift in Hebrews from the renewal of the creation to the removal of the created realm, and a real reorientation toward heaven. I mean, most pop Christians have this reorientation anyway. You know, we die and we go to heaven or hell. That's not really Paul or many of the early Christians' orientation, for whom the kingdom of God has something to do with the earth. In Revelation, the city of Jerusalem comes down to the earth. It is really John and Hebrews, in my opinion, that strongly orients the future toward an otherworldly location, toward heaven, for example, in the case of Hebrews. And that, to me, is a very appropriate shift to find in a post 70 date, when the navel of the universe, God's address, Jerusalem, has been obliterated to some extent. So that shift didn't make it to my overhead. That's another one of my arguments, that the overall fit of Hebrews is much better in a post 70 than a pre 70 context. Let me give some arguments now for a post 70 date. First of all, I think that the temporal indicators, the hints here and here of the timing of Hebrews, push us a lot later rather than earlier. We know from 2:3, as we've said, that the audience is second generation Christian. Now that could be very early, but 13:7, remember your leaders and imitate the outcome of their life, imitate their faith. Remember the outcome of their life. Again, leaders of Christianity, I don't think, really begin to die for their faith until the 60s. 60s are just a really hard time, no matter what century you're in. I also think that the past persecution that the author mentions in chapter 10 really fits the Nero time. If we're talking Rome, that Neronic persecution, I really think, fits much better the author's description of previous persecution uh, than um, uh, than William Lane suggests it's AD 49 when they're kicked out of town. Um, and of course, the next crisis I think the Christians would have experienced after Nero's persecution is probably the time of the Jerusalem destruction and the Jews being paraded through Rome. So I think that fits very well. The second argument for a post 70 date is the fact that Hebrews has a theoretical versus a concrete argument. It is exactly what I think we would expect if you're stepping back and kind of trying to assess the Levitical cultus as an institution after the temple has been destroyed. Hebrews never talks about the temple, it talks about the tabernacle. So I think that's appropriate to a time of reflection after its destruction. Notice the absence of Jew-Gentile rhetoric in Hebrews. Paul has Jew-Gentile um, rhetoric. He has to explain why the Gentiles are in. But there's none of that in Hebrews. In fact, Gentiles are assumed to be within the seed of Abraham without argument. To me, this pushes us toward a later rather than earlier date. And I resisted for a second, but I can't resist remembering a line from one of the Star Trek movies, the early movies, where basically there is this sense that there will never be peace between the Federation and the Klingon Empire while Captain Kirk is alive. Well, anyway, maybe that's irrelevant, but I kind of think of that. That while Paul was alive, there's still this live Jew-Gentile kind of Christian tension that seems, it seems like Hebrews is the next generation where those issues are to some extent a thing of the past. And of course, the destruction of the temple would have made some of those things a thing of the past. Some of you may know of F.C. Bauer's claim that when we don't see the Jew-Gentile debate in the New Testament, that represents, synthesis, the Hegelian synthesis, the after Paul, and Jerusalem Church that's been resolved, and that's in later Catholic Christianity. I'm not arguing for anything like that. Um, Obviously, Bauer shoved the Bible into preconceived philosophical templates he had in his mind. But I think there is, in a general, some sense, there's some truth to the idea that these things get ironed out later. Um, I'm not going to die for that, but I think it makes sense to some degree. The tone to me of Hebrews does not fit the kind of tone that would be needed if you were going to make an anti-cultist rhetoric while the temple is still standing. I just think if Hebrews were really a polemic against use of the temple, it would have to be a lot stronger and a lot more direct than it actually um, is. I think it's hard for us to imagine how much force and what them's fighting words, how hostile that kind of a message would be. I don't think Hebrews has that tone. It doesn't have that direct and polemic argument, as I've mentioned before. And lastly, I just think it fits. I think that the overall picture, a post 70 reading of Hebrews, provides us, I believe, with the most coherent, comprehensive accounting for the situation of Hebrews. So there you have some of my arguments for a post 70 date for the epistle or the sermon that we call Hebrews. And of course, as I've said, most of my rationale plays into my sense of the overall situation of Hebrews. I just think it fits the best. Thank you for joining me on this podcast venture.